Daniel Harrow did not look like a man who needed saving. He stood 6 feet and 2 inches of weathered silence, with hands that had fixed broken things longer than most people in Callum County had been alive. He owned 200 acres of Appalachian hillside, 3 horses, a dog named Bucket, and a reputation for being the kind of man who finished what he started. Nobody had ever called him foolish. Not once. Not in 38 years. So when the whole family sat down at his mother's kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon in October and told him he was making the worst mistake of his life, he did something that surprised every single one of them. He listened. He sat with his hands flat on the worn oak surface, right where his father used to rest his coffee mug for 30 years, and he let them talk. His mother, Gloria, went first. She was a small woman who said large things and had never once needed to raise her voice to make a room go quiet. She said that Mara Voss was not the kind of woman a man built a life with. She said it kindly, the way people say things they have been rehearsing. His brother Marcus went next. Marcus was louder and less careful, and he used words like reputation and history and what people are saying, as though the opinion of Callum County was a document Daniel had signed without reading. His cousin Len sat at the end of the table and nodded along, and his Aunt Patricia kept refilling the coffee cups, because that was what Patricia did when a conversation made her nervous. They talked for 40 minutes. Daniel looked at the worn ring in the wood where his father's mug used to sit. His father, Earl Harrow, had been dead for 11 years. The ring in the wood was still there. Some marks don't leave just because the person who made them is gone. When they finished, he stood up. He put on his coat. "I hear you," he said, and then he walked out. His mother called his name once from the kitchen window. He kept walking, not out of anger, not out of disrespect, out of the simple, hard knowledge that the conversation was finished and the decision was already made, and there was nothing left to do at that table except sit there and pretend he was still deciding. He had been deciding for 18 months. The thing about Callum County was that it had a long memory and a short imagination. It remembered what Mara Voss had been when she first arrived, which was a stranger with Ohio license plates, and a quiet child, and a past that people filled in with their own guesses when they did not have actual information. 2 ex-husbands, that was the part people said out loud. The rest they invented. A woman who couldn't make things work, they said. A woman who left. As though leaving a bad situation was the same thing as being a bad person. As though the story of a failed marriage had only one side, and it was always the woman's. Daniel had heard all of it. He had heard it at the feed store and at the gas station and at the diner where he ate breakfast on Wednesday mornings. He had sat with it the way he sat with everything that required thought, quietly, for a long time, without rushing to a conclusion. What he had noticed, in those 18 months, was simple. The town had a story about Mara Voss, and then there was Mara Voss herself. The two things did not match. He had first seen her on a Thursday in April, at Guthrie's Feed and Supply. She was trying to load 40-pound bags of mulch into the back of a white pickup truck with a tailgate that wouldn't latch properly. She had one bag in and was working on the second, and the tailgate kept swinging down, and she kept closing it with her hip and positioning the bag, and the whole thing was taking a long time. She was not asking for help. She was not looking around the parking lot for someone to come assist her. She was just working through the problem, methodically, with the focused expression of someone who had learned that waiting for help was a slower strategy than figuring it out yourself. Daniel walked over and held the tailgate while she loaded the remaining bags. She said, "Thank you," without looking up, the way you thank someone when you're concentrating on something else. He said, "That pin is cracked. That's why it won't hold." She looked at the pin. She looked at him. She said, "I know. I've been meaning to get to it." Her voice was even, not apologetic. She wasn't explaining herself to him. She was just answering. He nodded and walked back to his truck. That was all. But he thought about her on the drive home. Not in a complicated way. He thought about how she hadn't performed helplessness to get assistance. She had just worked through the problem until someone helped, and then she had accepted the help without making a production of it. He thought about how she had looked at the cracked pin and said she knew, and the way she said it made him believe she actually knew. Small things. But Daniel had learned, over 38 years, that small things were the most accurate information you could get about a person. He went back to Guthrie's the following week. Not for her. He needed mineral supplements for the horses, but he paid attention to whether he would see her again. He told himself he was being practical about it. He was not being practical about it. She was not there. He saw her 6 weeks later at the county road, pulled over with a flat tire, and her son standing beside her on the gravel shoulder. The boy was about 7, and he was very serious about holding the lug wrench. Daniel pulled over. He helped change the tire. The boy handed him each lug nut very carefully, one at a time, like they were precious things that needed protecting. "Good helper," Daniel said to the boy. The boy's name was Eli. He said, "I know how to do it. I'm just letting you do the heavy part." Mara looked at Daniel over the boy's head, and there was something in her expression that was not quite a smile, but was close to one, a controlled amusement, a recognition, as though she had spent 7 years being surprised by Eli, and had finally stopped being surprised by being surprised. Daniel laughed. He did not laugh often. The sound startled even him a little. They talked on the side of that road for 12 minutes. He knew because he looked at his watch afterward and thought, 12 minutes. He had not noticed the time passing. That was new. Her aunt had lived in Callum County for 30 years, she explained, and when the woman got sick, Mara had come down from Columbus to help. She had meant to stay 6 weeks. That had been 8 months ago. The county was cheaper than she expected, and Eli had started sleeping through the night within 2 weeks of arriving, which she credited to the quiet and to the air, and she was not willing to trade that back for anything. She said all of this plainly, without apology, as though her decisions were reasonable things that did not require defense. He asked if she needed anything else before he left. She said no and meant it. He drove home and thought, for the rest of that evening, about 12 minutes. He ran into her 4 more times over the following 2 months, and each time it was in a public place, and each time the conversation was short and easy, in the way that conversations are only easy when both people are telling the truth. She asked him once about the best vet in the county for a horse with a hoof abscess, and he gave her a name and a number, and she wrote them in a small notebook she kept in her jacket pocket. She didn't have the phone out for it. She had an actual notebook. He noticed that. He filed it under accurate information. He asked her, on a Tuesday in September, if she wanted to get coffee. She looked at him for a moment, not suspiciously, but the way a careful person looks at an offer they haven't fully accounted for yet. Then she said yes. They got coffee. They talked for an hour and 40 minutes. He drove home and thought, an hour and 40 minutes. And that was the moment he knew something had changed in the structure of his days, and that he did not want it to change back. What he did not tell his family at the kitchen table, because it was not something that could be said at a table, was this. He had been going through the motions of his own life for a long time. He was not unhappy. He was not broken. He was just present without being moved. And he had come to believe, somewhere around his 35th year, that being moved was something that happened to other people, that he had missed whatever window existed for that the farm and the horses and the routine and the fence posts were enough, and would have to be enough. And then 12 minutes on the side of a county road had shown him he was wrong. He did not tell his family this. He just put on his coat and walked out to his truck in October and drove home through the hills as the light went flat and gray across the ridgeline, and he thought about the worn ring in the wood where his father's mug used to sit, and how some marks were permanent, whether you wanted them to be or not. Mara was at the farm when he got back. She was in the small paddock near the barn, watching one of the horses, a bay mare named June, move along the fence line. She had a cup of coffee in her hand that she had made herself in his kitchen, because she had a key by then, and that was the kind of thing they did. Eli was inside, asleep on the old sofa in the front room, which was the other kind of thing they did. He stood beside her and watched June move in the last of the light. She said, without looking at him, "How did it go?" He said, "How do you think?" She was quiet for a moment. "I can go, Daniel. I've told you that. If this is making your life hard, I can just go." He put his arm around her shoulders. "Stop saying that," he said. She leaned into him just slightly. Just enough. June moved along the fence in the fading light, easy and unhurried, as though no one had ever told her to go faster, or be something other than what she was. The warning was over. Daniel had heard it. And he had chosen, clearly, deliberately, and without any regret at all, to ignore every word of it. It started at a feed store, and it started the way most real things start, without any announcement. Mara Voss had not come to Callum County looking for anything. She was very clear about that, even years later when people wanted the story to be more romantic at the beginning than it actually was. She came because her Aunt Norma was dying, and Norma had nobody else, and Mara was the kind of person who showed up when there was nobody else. She had always been that kind of person. It had cost her more than most people knew. She drove into the county on a Wednesday evening in February, with Eli in the back seat, and 2 suitcases in the trunk, and a very precise plan in her head. 6 weeks. Help Norma through the worst of it. Find a home nurse to cover the rest. Go back to Columbus. Go back to the apartment and the job at the accounting firm, and the routine she had built from scratch after the second time she had to start over. She was 34 years old, and she was tired, in a particular way that is not about sleep. It is about the long labor of maintaining a life that keeps requiring you to rebuild it. She had done the rebuilding twice. She was good at it. She did not want to have to be good at it anymore. Norma lasted 8 weeks. She went gently, which was the best thing that could be said about it, and Mara held her hand at the end, and Eli sat in the waiting room of the county hospital and drew horses in his notebook because he had been drawing horses since he was 4 years old, and nobody had ever told him to stop. After Norma was gone, Mara sat in the small rented house on Ridge Road that she had taken month to month and looked at the numbers on her phone. The apartment in Columbus was $340 a month, more expensive than this house. Her job could be done remotely. She had been doing it remotely for 6 months already. Eli had started at the county school and had not had a nightmare in 11 days, which was a number Mara tracked in her own notebook the way some people track the weather. She called her landlord in Columbus and gave her 30 days' notice. She did not call it staying. She called it waiting to see. She was precise about the difference. The county was not exactly friendly to her at first. It was not cruel either. It was the particular coolness of a place where everyone already knows everyone, and a newcomer is regarded with the polite patience of people who are waiting to see what category you belong to before they decide how to treat you. Mara was used to this. She had a way of moving through it without flinching. She kept to herself. She was pleasant at the grocery store and the gas station and the school pickup line. She learned which diner had good pie, and which garage wouldn't overcharge her, and which neighbors would say good morning, and which ones would look past her like she wasn't there. She met Daniel Harrow in April, and the first time meant nothing, except that a man held a tailgate so she could load her bags, and she said thank you, and he said the pin was cracked, and she said she knew. That was all. She drove home thinking about Mulch and not about him. The second time was different. Eli had pulled the lug wrench out from under the seat of the truck with the self-possession of a child who has watched something done enough times to believe he could supervise it. He was serious about the lug nuts. He handed them over one by one, and Daniel had laughed, which was not the reaction Eli usually got from adults, who tended to either ignore him or be charmed in a performed way that Eli saw through immediately. Daniel had laughed because it was genuinely funny, and Eli noticed the difference. In the truck afterward, Eli said, "That man laughs like he means it." Mara said, "Yeah, he does." Eli went back to his notebook, drew a horse, said nothing else. But Mara thought about it. She thought about the way a real laugh sounded compared to a polite one. She thought about how rare it was. She filed it away, and did not take it out again for 6 weeks, and then she ran into Daniel at the hardware store, and they talked for 8 minutes, and she walked to her truck afterward, thinking that she was very careful now about what she let herself want, and that she was going to have to be extra careful about this. She had been careful twice before, with 2 different men, and the care had not been enough. The first marriage was her early 20s, when she was still operating under the belief that love was sufficient, and that what she brought to a relationship would be met with what she gave. It was not. The man was not cruel. He was simply not there in the ways that mattered, and she spent 6 years trying to make up the difference before she understood that you cannot love someone into presence. You cannot want enough for both people. She left quietly. She took nothing that was not hers. The second time she had been more careful. She had waited longer and watched harder, and believed every good thing she saw. She had been wrong about what she saw. By the time the truth of it became clear, Eli was 3, and she was starting over with a child on her hip, and a much sharper understanding of what she would and would not accept from another human being. After that, she had decided that being alone was not a failure. It was a preference, and she had made her peace with it. She was building something good for Eli. She was building something solid for herself. It did not require a man in it to count as a life. And then Daniel asked her for coffee in September, and she looked at him for a moment before she said yes, because old habits of caution are slower to leave than old habits of trust. Coffee turned into an hour and 40 minutes. He told her about the farm and about his father, who had died when Daniel was 27, and left him the land and a philosophy about work that Daniel described as quiet and plain, and basically right. He told her about the horses the way people talk about things they understand deeply, but have never had to explain out loud before. He asked her about Eli, and he listened to what she said, and he asked a second question based on the first, which was not something everyone did. A lot of people asked about Eli, and then waited for the sentence to finish so they could say something about themselves. Daniel asked a second question. She noticed this. She also noticed that he never asked about her ex-husbands, which was what most men asked about, because 2 ex-husbands was the kind of number that made people curious in an uncomfortable way. He did not ask. He talked to her like the past was hers to share or keep as she chose, and he had no vote in it either way. She drove home and thought that she was in trouble. She meant it the good way. She also meant it the honest way, because trouble is trouble whether it comes wrapped in something good or not, and she was not in the habit of lying to herself. She told herself to be slow about it. She told herself to watch. She told herself that one coffee meant nothing, and that she should not start imagining structures on a foundation that did not exist yet. Then 2 weeks later there was a Ziploc bag in her mailbox. Inside it was a tailgate pin, the correct size for her truck, brand new. There was no note. There was no explanation. There was just the part, sitting in the bag, the way a practical person handles a practical problem, when they have thought about it and have the means to address it. She stood at the mailbox for a long time holding the bag. She had been brought flowers before. She had been written long messages before. She had been told she was beautiful and interesting and worth knowing, by men who believed all of those things until they didn't. She had never had anyone fix a tailgate pin without being asked, and leave it in a bag with no note. It was such a small thing. It was the smallest thing, and it reached her in a place that flowers had never reached, because it said something different than flowers said. It said, I paid attention. It said, I remembered. It said, I saw a problem in your life and I fixed it because I could, and I did not need you to thank me for it. She put the pin in herself that afternoon. It took 12 minutes. It held perfectly. She called him that evening. She said, the pin works. He said, good. They talked for 20 minutes. She laughed twice. He laughed once. She hung up, and Eli, who was eating cereal at the kitchen table and had been listening with the particular skill of a child who understands more than adults think, said, was that the man who laughs like he means it? She said, yes. Eli ate another spoonful of cereal. Good, he said, and went back to his notebook. Over the months that followed, things grew in the quiet way that real things grow, without drama and without speed. He came to the house for dinner on a Wednesday in November, and Eli showed him the horse drawings, and Daniel looked at each one with the same seriousness he brought to everything that deserved attention. He told Eli that the proportions were correct, which they were, and Eli's face went through something complicated, and finally settled on deeply satisfied. Mara stood in the kitchen doorway and watched this, and she thought that the thing she had been most afraid of was not that a man would hurt her again. She had survived being hurt. She knew the dimensions of that. What she had been afraid of was that Eli would let someone in, and then that person would leave, and she would have to watch her son learn the wrong lesson from it. Daniel ate dinner at her table and asked Eli to show him the horse book he had been reading, and Eli produced a battered library copy on horse anatomy, and they spent 30 minutes on it together, while Mara washed dishes in the kitchen and felt something in her chest that she did not name yet because it was too new and she was still too careful. In February, she took him to see her Aunt Norma's grave, which she visited every month. He stood beside her and did not say anything, which was the correct thing. She had been waiting, without knowing she was waiting for a person who understood when silence was the right response. She explained to him, on the walk back to the truck, why she had stayed in Callum County. She had always meant it to be temporary, she said, but Eli slept here, and she could breathe here, and something about this county, which was not her county, and had not yet decided whether to accept her, felt like the place where she could finally stop moving. He said, "Then stay." 2 words, plain and quiet and absolute. She looked at him and thought that she had been explained to, dismissed, misread, misused, and misremembered by enough people in her life that she had nearly lost confidence in her own reading of a person. But she was not misreading this, she was certain. She said, "Okay." She meant it in more ways than one. By April they were past the stage of explaining themselves, and into the much quieter, much more significant stage of simply being around each other. He had a key to her house. She had a key to his. Eli could name every horse on the property, and had a particular bond with June, the bay mare, whom he visited every weekend morning with a carrot he cut himself. The county was watching all of this. Mara could feel it. She had been watching the county watch her since February. She knew what was being said. She had not spent enough time in small towns to be unaware of how quickly a story forms around a woman with history, and how slowly it changes once it has formed. She told Daniel once, on a Sunday evening in May, that she was aware of what people said about her, and that she understood if it made things difficult. He was fixing the fence post at the edge of the lower paddock. He drove the post another 2 inches into the ground with 2 efficient strikes, and then straightened and looked at her. "People say things," he said. "Yes," she said. "They're usually working with incomplete information," he said. "Yes," she said again. He turned back to the fence post. "I have complete information," he said, "so I'm not concerned." She looked at the back of his shoulders and thought that she had spent years being misread and mischaracterized, and that this was what it felt like when someone simply decided to trust what they had actually witnessed. It felt like something being released from a long tension. It felt like a fist slowly opening. She did not cry. She was not the crying kind, but she felt it. The night the county sat around his mother's kitchen table and told him to give her up, Mara sat at her own kitchen table and helped Eli with his reading homework and kept her phone face down. She had told Daniel she would not call. Whatever they had to say to him was between him and his family, and she refused to be the reason a man was cut off from his people. But she knew what was happening in that kitchen, and she sat with the knowledge of it like a stone in her lap. She had told him to choose his family. She had meant it. She had never stopped meaning it, even as she hoped, quietly and without saying it out loud, that he would choose her instead. She heard his truck on the gravel at 8:40 in the evening. She heard him come through the front door and walk through to the kitchen where she was sitting. He put his arm around her from behind and rested his chin on her head. She said quietly, so as not to wake Eli, who had fallen asleep over his reader, "You don't have to tell me." He said, "I told them I heard them, then I left." She put her hand over his. Outside, it was very quiet, the way October nights are in the Tennessee hills, cold and still and wide. She thought about the road she had driven down 14 months ago, the 2 suitcases, the plan that was going to last 6 weeks. She thought about tailgate pins and carrot-fed horses, and a man who laughed like he meant it. She thought that she had not come here looking for anything, and she had found everything anyway. The silence came first. It always does. In a place like Callum County, where people have known each other for 3 and 4 generations, the withdrawal of warmth is a social event as organized and deliberate as a church supper, just without the food. Nobody declared anything. Nobody confronted Daniel directly again. The kitchen table conversation had been the declaration. What followed was the enforcement, and enforcement in small towns never needs to be announced. His mother, Gloria Harrow, stopped calling on Sundays. This was the first thing and the most significant, because Sunday calls had been the rhythm of Daniel's adult life for as long as he could remember. Through his 20s, through his father's illness, through the years of managing the farm alone after Earl died, through every stretch of difficult weather and hard season, the Sunday call had been constant. He had not always wanted to talk. He had sometimes picked up the phone out of duty more than need. But it had been there, and its presence had meant something he had not fully measured until it was gone. The first Sunday it did not come. He waited until 7 in the evening, and then called himself. Gloria answered, and they talked for 9 minutes. She asked about the farm. She asked about his back, which had been giving him trouble in August. She did not ask about Mara. She did not ask about Eli. When the call ended, Daniel held the phone for a moment and understood, very precisely, what had just happened. The conversation had been a door opened a specific width, wide enough to show care, narrow enough to exclude. He set the phone down and went out to check on the horses. Marcus was louder about it, which was his way. Marcus had always been the brother who said the thing everyone else was thinking, and he had never much cared whether the timing was right. He called on a Tuesday evening and said, without introduction, "People are talking, Daniel." Daniel asked who. Marcus said everyone. Daniel said that everyone always talked, and that this was a fact about people and not a reason to change his life. Marcus said he was being hard-headed. Daniel said he was being clear-headed, and those were different things. Marcus said their mother was upset. Daniel said he knew. Marcus said that Mara Voss had 2 failed marriages behind her, and a reputation in this county that a man with his standing ought to think about more carefully. Daniel said he thought about it very carefully, and had reached his own conclusions. The call ended without resolution, which was unusual for Marcus, who preferred to finish what he started. The fact that he hung up instead of pressing further told Daniel something Marcus probably did not intend to reveal, that he had run out of actual arguments and was running on emotion, and he knew it. The church was the quietest kind of difficult. Daniel had attended Calvary Baptist his entire life. He had been baptized there at 12, had sat in the 3rd pew from the front for 30 years, had helped repaint the fellowship hall and clear the fallen pine tree from the parking lot after the ice storm 3 winters back. He knew every family in that building. He had watched their children grow up, and some of their parents grow old and go, and the church had been, as much as the land itself, a part of what it meant to be Daniel Harrow of Callum County, Tennessee. What changed after October was not dramatic. Nobody asked him to leave. Nobody said his name wrong from the pulpit. It was smaller than that, and therefore harder to argue with. The conversations after service grew shorter. The space beside him in the pew was left vacant more often than not. Pastor Elkins, who had known Daniel since childhood, would squeeze his shoulder in passing but no longer stop to talk the way he used to, standing in the parking lot for 20 minutes discussing the state of the county and the state of the world. That shoulder squeeze was still warm. It was just brief. The brevity was the message. Daniel felt all of this. He was not naive. He had grown up in this county, and he understood its communication precisely, the way a man understands the weather patterns on his own land. He knew what was happening. He knew it was organized, not by cruelty, but by the sincere belief of people who loved him, that they were protecting him by making the cost of his choice visible. They were laying out the price tag. They expected him to look at it and reconsider. He looked at it. He did not reconsider. He started fixing fence posts. There was one on the north edge of his property that had been loose since spring, leaning at an angle that would eventually mean the line going down. He had been putting it off. He went out the morning after the Sunday call that did not come, and pulled the old post and set a new one, tamping the ground firm around its base in the cold November air. It took an hour. When he was done, the line was straight. He found another one the following week, then 2 more in December. By the end of January, there were 6 posts he had replaced or reset, and he was finding the work satisfying in a way that was hard to explain, but was something like, the ground does not have an opinion about who you love. The wood does not hold a position. The fence simply needs to be right, and then it is right, and that is the whole of it. He did not talk to Mara much about what was happening, which was a decision he made deliberately. She already knew. She was not a woman who missed things, and she had been watching the county reconfigure itself around her presence since she arrived. She had offered, twice, to remove herself from the equation. Both times he had told her to stop. She had stopped. But he knew she carried it, the weight of being the reason for someone's difficulty, and that carrying that weight was something she had practiced with from previous chapters of her life, that he did not push her to describe. What he did instead was show up. He showed up at her house on Wednesday evenings with whatever was practical. Firewood one week, since the wood she had bought was green and burning badly. A set of window seals another week because he had noticed the draft in the front room. He showed up the way the tailgate pin had shown up, without announcement, without a need to be thanked. He showed up because being there was the accurate response to the situation, and he was a man who preferred accuracy. Eli turned 8 in January. Daniel arrived at the small birthday gathering, which was 4 of Eli's school friends and their parents, with a handmade wooden horse. He had carved it himself over 2 weeks in the evenings, which Mara did not know, and which he did not mention. Eli held it with both hands, and looked at it for a long time without saying anything. Then he said, "It's June." It was, in fact, June. Daniel had matched the proportions to the actual mare, the small white mark on the nose, the particular slope of the haunch. He had done this because Eli deserved something made with that kind of attention, and because attention was the thing Daniel knew how to give. Eli set it very carefully on the windowsill in his room, which was where he kept his most important things. The birthday gathering was the first time Mara cried in front of Daniel. She was in the kitchen when it happened, and she cried for about 15 seconds and then stopped, and he came in and she said, "Don't look at me." And he looked at the ceiling for a moment, and then she laughed, and the moment passed, and neither of them needed to explain what it had been about. In February, Marcus called again. He was slightly different this time, less aggressive, more burdened. He said that their mother had not been sleeping well, that she was working herself up about it. Daniel said he was sorry to hear that, and meant it. He asked Marcus how the operation was going. Marcus ran a logging concern 20 miles to the west, and Marcus said fine, and they talked for a while about practical things, and near the end Marcus said, quietly, like a man letting air out of something, "I just don't understand what you see." Daniel thought about that for a long time after the call ended. He thought about what Marcus was really asking, which was not just about Mara but about Daniel himself, about why Daniel, who had always been reasonable and measured and careful, had chosen this thing that was costing him so much socially. Marcus could not understand the calculus because he was applying the wrong formula. He was weighing the relationship against the community's approval, and in that math, the relationship could not possibly win. But Daniel was not doing that math. Daniel was weighing the relationship against the life he had been living before it, which was a life that was fine and correct and utterly without the feeling of being moved. And in that math, the answer was obvious. He could not explain this to Marcus. He was not sure Marcus had the vocabulary for it yet, and he meant that without judgment. Some things are only visible from the inside. What he told Marcus was, "I see a woman who does what she says, and says what she means, and shows up when it's hard. That's all." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Okay," in a tone that was not agreement, but was not argument either. It was the tone of a man storing something away to look at later. Spring came, and the county continued its slow negotiation with itself. At the school, Eli was beginning to find his footing in the way that children do when they finally stop being the new one. He had 3 friends now, genuine ones, the kind he brought home on Friday afternoons. He talked about the horses with anyone who would listen, and had become, in the particular economics of 8-year-old social hierarchy, known as the kid who knew about horses, which was a solid position in a farming county. Mara was rebuilding, quietly, from the outside in. She showed up for the school bake sale. She brought food to the fire department fundraiser. She helped a neighbor, an older woman named Harriet Park, track down a plumber when Harriet's pipes froze in March. She did not do these things strategically. She did them because they needed doing, and she was capable of doing them. That was the whole reason. But Daniel watched the town begin, very slowly, to revise. Not dramatically, not with apologies, with the small incremental shifts of people who are quietly updating a story they told too quickly. At the diner one Wednesday morning, Carl Guthrie from the feed store stopped at his table and asked about the horses. Normal enough. But at the end he said, "That woman of yours helped my wife figure out her tax return. Said she didn't even charge anything. Just helped." He said it in the particular tone of a man adjusting his position on something. Daniel said, "She's like that." Carl nodded, moved on. It was the smallest thing. It was also the beginning. By summer, Daniel had replaced 11 fence posts on the north edge of the property. He stood back one morning in July and looked at the line of them, straight and solid and right, and thought about the way a thing that has been loose for a long time can be made solid again if you are patient about it and willing to do the work. He was patient. He was willing. He thought about his mother's Sunday calls, which had not resumed, about the pew at Calvary Baptist, still slightly empty beside him, about Marcus, who called now without agenda and sometimes talked for 30 minutes about nothing important. Things were moving, not quickly, not cleanly, but they were moving. He went inside and started coffee, and Mara's truck pulled up the gravel drive at 7:15 because she and Eli had started spending Saturday mornings at the farm, and Eli came through the door still wearing one boot and holding the other, explaining at length about a dream he had about June winning a race against a tractor, which he considered a realistic scenario, and Mara came in behind him carrying a bag of groceries and rolling her eyes at Daniel over Eli's head, and the kitchen filled with the noise of being alive, which was the sound Daniel had been missing for years without knowing what to call it. He poured 3 cups of coffee, one for himself, one for Mara, one for Eli, which was mostly milk and barely coffee, and which Eli drank with the great seriousness of a person conducting important business. Outside, the 11 fence posts stood solid on the north edge of the property. The morning was very good. The logging accident happened on a Tuesday in November. Marcus was working a section of timber on his western operation when a chain failed on the equipment he was using to move a freshly cut section of oak. The oak was 3 feet in diameter, and it did not fall the direction it was supposed to fall, and Marcus was where it fell. He was alive because his crew chief saw it happening, and shouted, and Marcus moved fast, but he did not move quite fast enough. The tendon in his left leg, the one behind the knee, was severed cleanly, and he hit the ground in a section of Tennessee hillside that required 20 minutes for the ambulance to reach. Daniel heard about it from his mother, who called him for the first time in weeks, and her voice in that call sounded like herself again, in the way that crisis sometimes strips away the distance people have maintained and delivers them back to what they actually are. She said Marcus was in surgery. She said the tendon could be repaired, but the recovery would be long. She said Marcus's wife, Carol, was 8 months pregnant and already under her own medical care for blood pressure that had been too high since summer, and that Carol's mother was 3 states away, and that there was no one to manage the farm or the kids. Daniel was in his truck before she finished the second sentence. He did not call Mara. Mara called him. She had heard through Harriet Park, who had heard through the phone chain that moved news through Callum County faster than any other delivery system. She said, "I heard about Marcus. What do you need?" He said, "I'm going to the hospital now. I don't know yet." She said, "Okay, I'll figure out the kids." He said, "Mara, you don't have to." She said, "I know I don't have to. I'm going to. Drive safe." She hung up before he could say anything else. Marcus and Carol had 3 children. The oldest was 9, a girl named Lucy. The middle one was 7, a boy named Grant. The youngest was 4, a girl named Bee, who was at the age where everything was either wonderful or catastrophic with very little in between. Their usual arrangements had a neighbor, an older woman named Sylvia, who picked up Lucy and Grant from school, but Sylvia had been fighting a bad chest cold for 2 weeks and could not be around Carol's pregnancy or the children in close quarters. Mara called Sylvia, introduced herself, got the school schedule and the names and the routines and the particular food issue with Grant, who could not have certain things without a reaction. She wrote it all down in her notebook. She picked up Lucy and Grant from school that afternoon in her truck. Lucy was suspicious of her in the way that 9-year-olds are suspicious of new adults, which is precisely and without heat. Grant was quiet and watchful. Bea, whom Carol's sister-in-law had been watching for the day, Mara collected from a house on Miller Road where the sister-in-law, a woman named Diane, looked simultaneously relieved and slightly uncertain about handing 3 children over to a woman she had met 40 seconds ago. Mara introduced herself to each child by name. She explained who she was, and that she was Daniel's person, which Eli had started saying, and which she had adopted because it was simpler than the adult vocabulary. She told them they were going to her house for the night, which had horses on the property, and that they were welcome to help feed June if they wanted. Bee said, "June's a horse name." Mara said, "Yes it is. She's a bay mare." Bea considered this. "Okay," she said, and climbed into the truck. At the hospital, Marcus was out of surgery and in recovery when Daniel arrived. Gloria was in the waiting room with the particular contained expression of a woman managing fear through organization. Daniel sat beside her, and they did not speak for a long time, which was the first honest silence they had shared since October, and Daniel found it easier than the performances of normalcy they had been conducting at each other for months. Carol's room was 2 floors up. She had been admitted for monitoring because her blood pressure had spiked when she received the news. The baby was fine. Carol was holding herself together with the specific determination of a woman who had decided that falling apart was not an option she was currently able to afford. Daniel sat with her for an hour. He told her that the kids were fine and that they were being looked after. Carol asked by who, and he said Mara, and Carol looked at him for a moment with the expression of a woman who had heard a lot about Mara Voss, but had formed most of it at second hand, and then she said, "Is she good with them?" He said, "Yes." Carol said, "Okay," and she said it like she meant it. What happened over the following 6 weeks was not a single dramatic gesture. It was 37 separate practical decisions made by one person without being asked. Mara organized the meal rotation. This was the thing that happened in Clallam County when a family was in difficulty. Neighbors brought food, but it happened in the disorganized way of genuinely good intentions without coordination, which meant Tuesday might bring 4 casseroles and Thursday might bring nothing. Mara called 11 families, got their available dates, and built a schedule on a piece of paper she taped to Carol's refrigerator. It was never duplicated. It was never empty. She located a physical therapy clinic 40 minutes north that accepted Marcus's insurance when the clinic his surgeon recommended did not. She found this through 3 calls, the last of which was to a medical billing office where she explained the situation plainly and asked to speak to whoever handled exceptions. 40 minutes north was not ideal for a man on crutches, but it was better than out of pocket. She drove Lucy and Grant to school herself on the days when the neighbor arrangements fell through, which was 4 times in 6 weeks. She showed up without being called, because she had built a system for knowing when the arrangements were likely to fail, and she addressed it before it became a problem. The irrigation issue on Marcus's farm was invisible to everyone, because no one had been monitoring the secondary feed line that ran to the south pasture, which had developed a slow crack that had been losing pressure for weeks. Marcus's operation ran on thin margins, and the south pasture feed was connected to the winter supply for his cattle. Mara found it because she walked the property with Carol's brother-in-law on a Sunday afternoon, just to understand what needed watching, and she saw the soil saturation pattern near the second junction and traced it back. She called a plumber she knew from the Harriet Park job. He fixed it for what he said was fair. She paid half herself and said nothing about it. The one thing people saw, the visible thing, was the casserole dish. She brought it on a Wednesday 2 weeks into Marcus's recovery. He was home by then on crutches, managing the steps with poor grace, and a great deal of suppressed frustration. The casserole was chicken and rice, which Carol had mentioned was what Marcus asked for when he was sick, even though Marcus had not mentioned this to Mara himself, and had not known she was bringing it. The sticky note said, in her clear handwriting, "Reheat at 350. That was all. Marcus ate 2 portions of it that evening. Carol washed the dish and put it in the cabinet and did not return it. She was not sure exactly when she made this decision. It was not a deliberate one. The dish just stayed, and then time passed, and it was still there, and it had become, without ceremony, part of the kitchen. Daniel drove Marcus to his first physical therapy appointment in December. It was a 4-hour round trip including the session. They did not talk much in the car. Marcus slept on the way there. On the way back he was awake but quiet, watching the hills go by through the window. Outside Cartwright, with 20 miles still to go, he said, without introduction, "I was wrong about her." Daniel drove. The road was straight. The hills were bare and gray in the December light. He had waited 2 years to hear those words. He had not known he was counting, but some part of him had been, and now that the words were here, he sat with them for a moment and found that they did not feel the way he had expected. They felt correct. They did not feel triumphant. They did not dissolve the cost of the past 2 years, or replace what had been spent in silence and absence, and Sunday calls that did not come. They were right, and they were not enough, and they were what was available, and that was the reality of it. He said, "Okay." Marcus looked at him. "That's all you've got?" What else is there? Daniel said. Marcus was quiet again. Then he said, I thought you'd say something. Daniel said, I didn't need you to be right before. I don't need you to be right now. I needed her to be treated with basic decency. That's still what I need. Marcus looked out the window. She fixed my irrigation line, he said. I know, Daniel said. She didn't tell me. She told me after. That's how she is, Daniel said. Marcus pressed his forehead lightly against the window glass. She also paid half the plumber. I know, Daniel said again. She didn't tell me that either. No, Daniel said. She wouldn't. Marcus said nothing for a while. When he spoke again, it was quieter. The voice of a man who has located the place where he got it wrong and is still standing near it, not yet sure what to do with the proximity. What do I do with that, Daniel? Daniel said, You could say thank you. Marcus nodded. Slowly, with the look of a person making a decision. Yeah, he said, I could do that. They drove the rest of the way in the quiet that was different from the quiet of before. The quiet of before had been avoidance. This one was just the road, and two brothers, and the gray hills passing outside, and something that had been tight in Daniel's chest for 2 years beginning, just slightly, to loosen its hold. He thought about Marcus saying I was wrong about her, and the way the words had landed. He thought about the coat he had put on at his mother's kitchen table 14 months ago. He thought about the 11 fence posts, the casserole dish, the tailgate pin, the wooden horse that was still on Eli's windowsill. He thought that being right had never felt less important than it did right now. And he thought that this was not a failure of conviction. It was just the truth of what happens when the price of being right is someone else's pain, even if that someone else had spent their own currency poorly and ought to have known better. He was not glad Marcus had gotten hurt. He would have given up every vindication to have avoided it. But Marcus had said he was wrong about her, and that, small as it was and late as it was the beginning of something. Daniel intended to treat it carefully. He pulled into Marcus's driveway at 5 in the afternoon. Lucy and Grant were in the yard. They ran to the truck. Grant pulled the door open and grabbed Marcus's hand. Not carefully, just grabbed it, the way kids grab things they love without worrying about hurting them, because they do not imagine that love can break what it holds. Marcus said, Careful, buddy. Grant said, Sorry, but he did not let go. Lucy looked at Daniel over her brother's head and said, Is Mara coming Saturday? Daniel said yes. Lucy said, Good. She said she'd show me how to braid June's mane. She ran back to the yard. Daniel sat in the truck for a moment after Marcus had gone inside. He sat in the quiet of the driveway, with the hills going darker around the edges and the first cold of evening coming in off the ridgeline, and he thought that sometimes things turned, not because you forced them, not because you were owed it, but because something happens that strips the story down to what it actually contains, and what it contains is just people, trying to get through hard things, and a woman who shows up when it's hard, and does not keep a ledger of what she is owed. He drove home. The 11 fence posts were just visible in the last of the light on the north edge of the property. He went inside and called Mara. She picked up on the second ring. He said, Marcus said he was wrong about you. There was a pause. Then she said, How do you feel about that? He said, Like a coat that's one size too small. She was quiet for a moment. Then, Yeah, she said. That's about right. They talked for a while about other things, about Eli and the horse drawings and the school project on Tennessee geology that was due Friday, about whether the bay mare's right foreleg was tracking the way it should, about the casserole dish that Carol was still using. She said, before they hung up, I didn't do it to prove anything. I know, he said. I just want you to know that. Mara, he said, I know. She said goodnight. She said goodnight. He set the phone down and sat in the quiet of his kitchen and thought that she had spent enough years being misread that she still sometimes needed to correct the record, even when the record was already correct with the people who mattered. He was going to spend the rest of his life being one of the people who already knew. They got married on a Tuesday. It was the second week of March, the year after Marcus's accident, and the courthouse in Callum County was quiet on a Tuesday morning, because most people saved their significant events for weekends, and Tuesdays just held the regular business of living. The clerk who processed the paperwork was a woman named Beryl, who had been processing paperwork at that courthouse for 22 years, and who recognized Daniel Harrow the moment he walked in, because she had gone to school with his older cousin, and because Callum County was a place where most people's faces were already filed somewhere in your memory. Beryl said good morning, and processed the license without fanfare, which was exactly what Daniel had wanted. He had not told his family they were coming. He had not told his mother, who would have wanted a church service, and a reception, and 3 weeks of preparation. He had not told Marcus, who would have tried to show up on his recovering leg, and done some damage to the tendon that was still relearning its purpose. He had told Eli. Eli had come in his school clothes because it was a school morning, and the plan was courthouse first and school second, which Eli had agreed to with the calm of a child who understood that important things sometimes rearranged the ordinary order of a day. He wore his good jacket, the dark green one Mara had bought him in October that he had not grown into yet, and was slowly growing into now. He held the ring very carefully in his jacket pocket for the entire drive to the courthouse. He was the ring bearer. He was the only guest. He was 9 years old, and he was completely serious about the responsibility. The ceremony itself was 4 minutes. Beryl, who turned out to officiate these things when the county judge was occupied, read the words without rushing them. Daniel and Mara said yes in the right places. Eli produced the rings from his pocket with the precision of a surgeon. He handed them over one at a time. First Daniel's, then Mara's. And he watched the exchange with an expression that Daniel would remember for the rest of his life, which was the expression of a child watching something very important happen, and understanding that it was important without needing anyone to explain why. When it was done, Beryl shook their hands and said, "Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Harrow." And Mara said, "Thank you, Beryl," using her name because she had been reading the nameplate for 4 minutes, and because Mara was the kind of person who used people's names. Beryl looked slightly startled, and then pleased. She gave them a copy of the certificate in a folder with a small embossed seal on the front. They walked out into the March morning, which was cold and clear in the particular way of Tennessee spring before the warmth fully arrives, and Eli took Mara's hand on one side, and Daniel's on the other, and said, "Are we going to the farm after school?" Mara said yes. Eli said, "Good. I want to tell June." He said this completely seriously, and neither of them laughed, because it was completely serious. He had a relationship with that horse that required updating. They dropped Eli at school. He got out of the truck with his backpack, said bye, and went in. He did not make it a big thing. He was a child who knew how to hold big things lightly, which was the most useful skill Mara had given him, and the one she had not given him on purpose. He had learned it from watching her. The bonfire was 3 weeks later, on a Saturday evening in early April. Daniel had mentioned it to a few people. He had mentioned it to Marcus, who was walking without crutches now and carrying a slight drag in his left step that the therapist said would resolve. He had mentioned it to his mother. He had mentioned it to Carl Guthrie, and to Pastor Elkins, and to Harriet Park, and to Diane, Carol's sister-in-law, who had handed 3 children over to a stranger in November, with the faith of a person who had no other option, and had been grateful ever since. He had mentioned it to Sylvia, who had recovered from her chest cold. He had mentioned it to Eli's school friends' parents, 2 of whom had become something like friends to Mara over the winter. He had not invited anyone formally. He had mentioned it and told people the time and the location, which was the north edge of his property, by the line of 11 fence posts, and that there would be a fire and food. People came who had not been mentioned. This was fine. The gate was open. Gloria Harrow arrived at 7:15, which was 20 minutes after the fire was properly going. She came alone, without Marcus, who came separately with Carol and the children at 7:30. Gloria wore her good coat, the gray wool one that Daniel associated with Sunday services and family events. She stood at the edge of the gathering for a moment, locating things, the way she always did in a space where she was uncertain of her position. Mara was by the fire, talking to Harriet Park. She had a cup in her hand. She was wearing Daniel's old barn jacket over a dress, which was entirely her, practical and not particularly planned. Her hair was loose. She was laughing at something Harriet had said. Gloria walked toward her. Daniel watched this from across the fire. He did not move. He did not intercede. This was between these 2 women, and it needed to be between them without his management. Gloria stopped beside Mara, said something he could not hear. Mara turned and looked at her, and there was a moment between them that lasted about 4 seconds, which was long enough for both of them to understand what it was. Then Mara said something back, and Gloria nodded, and they embraced. It was not long enough. They both knew it. Neither of them said so. Daniel looked at the fire. He thought about 14 months of Sunday calls that did not come. He thought about the pew at Calvary Baptist with the empty space beside it. He thought about the coat he had put on in October at the kitchen table, and walked out and kept walking. He thought about what it costs to choose yourself when everything around you is organized, to make choosing yourself feel like abandonment. He did not feel triumphant. He had not expected to. Triumph was for people who had been waiting to win something, and he had not been trying to win. He had been trying to keep something true and whole and present in his life, which was a different project entirely. Eli was near the fence posts with Lucy and Grant, who had come with their parents. The three of them were looking at something on the ground, a rock or an insect, with the focused attention of children who have found something worth understanding. Bea was sitting on Marcus's good leg, which was the right one, which he was using as a chair while he stood on the recovering one and talked to Carol, who was holding their baby, born in December, a solid little person named Roy, who slept through social events with the confidence of someone who had made peace with the world already. The fire was good. The April night was cold enough to want it. Pastor Elkins came at 8. He brought his wife, Helen, who brought a pie that she set on the table without ceremony, because Helen Elkins did not need ceremony for anything. Elkins found Daniel by the fire and stood beside him and said, "Congratulations, son," the way he had said it to 20 years of young couples in that county. And then he said, slightly differently, "I've been wanting to say this for a while. I should have done better by you this year." Daniel said, "I know." Elkins nodded. He was a man who did not offer excuses for things he had done poorly. He had offered an acknowledgement. In his particular lexicon, this was significant. Daniel said, "She's made my life better, Elkins. Not just more full, actually better." Elkins looked at where Mara was standing, now talking to Carol, with the baby shifting between them because babies at county bonfires are passed around like good weather, shared without being asked to share. He said, "I can see that." Daniel said, "I wish you could have seen it sooner." Elkins said, "So do I." They stood by the fire. The night was cold and clear, and the stars over the Tennessee hills were the kind of stars that require dark to see properly, the kind that remind you the sky is full of things that are always there, and only visible under the right conditions. Marcus found him later, near the fence posts. He was moving carefully but not badly. He had a beer in the hand on his good side. He stood beside Daniel and looked at the fence posts in the firelight. 11, he said. 11, Daniel said. "You going to tell me why you count them?" Daniel said. "One for every week you all made things difficult." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's a very Daniel thing to do." Daniel said nothing. Marcus said, "I want to say something and I need you to let me finish." Daniel waited. Marcus said, "I spent a long time thinking I was protecting you. I want you to know I believed that. I wasn't trying to hurt you. I was operating on information I had decided was accurate without checking it carefully, and I was using your well-being as the reason. But looking back on it honestly, I think some of it was about what I thought your life was supposed to look like, and I'm not proud of that." Daniel let him finish. Marcus said, "And she fixed my irrigation line, and she organized the meals, and she drove my kids to school, and she paid half the plumber's bill without telling me until after, and she did all of it without—" He stopped, started again. "She did it the way a person does things when they're not keeping a score, and I was keeping a score about her, and she wasn't keeping one about me, and I don't know what to do with that except say I'm sorry and try to do better." He stopped talking. Daniel looked at the 11 fence posts. He said, "Thank you, Marcus." Marcus said, "That's all?" Daniel said, "What else would you want?" Marcus thought about it. "I guess that's right," he said. "That's probably right." They stood by the posts for a while. The fire was burning well. The county was gathered around it, more or less. The ones who had come and the ones who might yet come around. All of them contained for a moment in the same circle of warmth and light on a cold April night. Mara appeared beside Daniel. She had the barn jacket pulled around her, and the cup still in her hand. She looked at Marcus for a moment, and Marcus looked at her, and something passed between them that did not require Daniel's translation. Marcus said, "Thank you. For everything in November." Mara said, "You're welcome." No performance in it. No magnanimity. Just two words that were the honest response to an honest acknowledgement. She took Daniel's hand. He thought about February in the small rented house on Ridge Road, and Eli's nightmares finally going quiet, and a woman who had meant to stay 6 weeks and stayed because the rent was right and her son was sleeping. He thought about a parking lot in April, a cracked tailgate pin, a load of mulch. He thought about 12 minutes on the side of a county road, and the sound of his own laugh startling him. He thought about a Ziploc bag in a mailbox with no note, and what it meant that the absence of a note could say more than words usually managed. He thought about a mother's kitchen table in October, a worn ring in the wood where a dead man used to rest his mug, and a coat he put on and walked out in and never took off. He thought that the regret his family carried now was not the dramatic kind. It was not the regret of a single wrong decision. It was the quieter, harder kind, the kind that lives in the gap between who you thought you were and what you actually did, the kind that is not resolved by an apology at a bonfire, though the apology matters, the kind that you carry home and set on a shelf and see every morning alongside the other things that are permanent, whether you want them to be or not. He thought that they would all be fine. He thought that families were made of exactly this kind of thing: distance and return, error and correction, the long and effortful work of choosing each other again after you have failed. He thought that he loved his mother and his brother, and that the year of silence had not changed that, and that what it had changed was his understanding of the conditions under which their love operated, and that knowing the conditions was better than not knowing them, even when it hurt. Gloria found him at 9 o'clock, near the end of things. Most people had drifted away. The fire was lower. Eli was asleep against Daniel's jacket on the ground near the posts, which was the third time he had fallen asleep at the farm, and would not be the last. Gloria stood beside her son and looked at the sleeping boy, and then at the dying fire. She said, "He's a good boy." Daniel said, "He is." She said, "She's done well with him." He said, "Yes." She said, after a pause that held several other sentences she did not say, "Are you happy, Daniel?" He thought about the bonfire and the 11 fence posts, and the wooden horse on Eli's windowsill, and the way Mara had said he was her person, and the tailgate pin that held perfectly. He thought about the sound of his kitchen filling up with noise on Saturday mornings. "Yeah," he said, "I am." His mother nodded. He knew the nod. It was the nod of a woman taking in information about a country she had not visited, and could not quite picture, but was beginning to believe was real. She hugged him once, the good, tight kind. She held it for a count of 3 and then let go. She walked to her car and drove home through the hills. Daniel stood at the edge of his land in the dark after the fire went out, with Eli asleep nearby and Mara beside him, and he looked at the 11 fence posts, barely visible now against the April sky. He had replaced them one by one, in the cold, alone, during the hardest year of his adult life. They stood straight. They held the line. That was all a fence post needed to do. That was enough.